Got a little sound bug.
How's that?
That's way better.
All right, let's do that.
Welcome, Ryan Holiday.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm pleased to finally get to talk to you. I've seen your name around for a long time, and I'm excited that we get to chat. Before we get going, I'm going to hit you with 3 rapid-fire radio-style morning DJ questions. Give you an either or.
I'm always terrible at these.
So we can get to know you a little bit better.
Okay.
It's an either or. Do you prefer Saturday or Sunday?
Saturday.
Okay, reasonable answer. Sunday usually gets depressing.
Yes.
Right. Do you prefer skiing or surfing?
Neither, but I guess surfing.
Okay, you'd rather be closer to the ocean than mountaintops?
Yes.
Okay. Led Zeppelin or Elton John?
I think Led Zeppelin's very overrated, so I would go Elton John.
Okay. It feels like we've got a window into your soul.
Yes.
Which is what our goal here is to get a window into your soul. So speaking of souls, one thing that that comes to mind to me when I think of your work is that it has happened quickly. Your first book, I think, came out in 2012. Is that right?
Yes.
So it's been 8 years now, and the rate of output has been high. Is that something that you're comfortable with? Was it something is that how you tend to live your life, or did it just happen?
It sort of just happened, and honestly, like it doesn't feel fast to me. Like I would say there were several junctures where it was slowed down against my will. So like I find publishing to be very slow and a very infuriating business for that reason. But the way I always work is like when you do a book, like Lives was finished, draft, like the first draft, like the book is basically done. It's accepted by the publisher probably in December of 2019. And then was like done, like completely finished. No more work for me probably in January or February. And then so for most writers, that would mean they sort of stop in December. Then this book comes out, and then it does what it does, and then they just sort of start thinking about what they want to do next. I did a ghostwriting project in between there, and then the last 3 months I've been working on the book that I'll have come out after this one. So like there's a lot of dead time in publishing that I just don't really accept.
Right. So do you feel like, do you also give talks? Like what makes up your life? Like could you take us through a little bit of like the percentage time that you spend on various pursuits?
So I write nonfiction, and most nonfiction writers tend to make more money speaking or consulting than they do on the sales of the books. I've been very fortunate that my books have also sold quite well, so that hasn't been quite the case for me. But I up until March, I was doing a fair amount of speaking. The other thing that a lot of nonfiction writers do, there's sort of like the people who publish nonfiction, and then there's the people who write nonfiction. Sort of the distinction I'd make, because a lot of like Reed Hastings has a book coming out. I was just reading about it in the New York Times this morning. Obviously, he did not write that book. Some other nonfiction writer did that book with and for him. So I do a lot of ghostwriting where there's not really a role of like a producer in traditional publishing in the way there are with movies, but my writing partner and I do a lot of sort of packaging and producing on projects if we're not writing them as well. So my sort of day is like the first half of the day is usually spent on my writing projects, and then the second half of the day is editing or other writing / marketing projects. So anyways, that's sort of how I break it down.
It would seem to me that unlike many people, you probably were fairly prepared for what this career might look like based on kind of the marketing and PR background. But I would also guess there's probably been a few things that are different than you expected. Are there things you would tell yourself at age 19 if you were to go back to talk to younger Ryan and say like, look, this is what's actually going to be the truth about this?
Yeah. So my first book, when it came out in 2012, like I was very convinced that like if it didn't come out like right now, I was
Hmm.
going to miss the window. So that book, I think I sold it in October or November of 2011, and it came out in the summer of 2012, which is very fast.
Hmm.
And I thought like, so we didn't do galleys, it was embargoed, it just went, it was very fast. Um, and I was convinced that even that was probably too short of a window, like, or too long of a window, that we were going to miss like this very timely book, because it's a book about media and what I thought was just sort of a moment in sort of media history.
Hmm.
But it turns out I was probably like 6 years early, you know.
Right.
So the point is, I think as I've done this more, I think what I've started to get better at totally tuning out what's happening in the world, because um, the vast majority of books that are successful not in a 12-month window, but in a 12-year period. And
Hmm.
so the whole point should be to make a book that is as timeless as possible. And that's something I don't think publishing is, weirdly, even though that's where most revenue in publishing comes from, that's not at all how the industry is set up. Even though the rent on the Penguin Random House building in Manhattan is paid for by books that 3 generations of editors ago acquired,
Hmm.
98% of the attention is focused on the new celebrity book or the newest anti-Trump book or whatever it is.
Hmm.
And so authors get caught up in that, and they go, well, what's happening right now? What's trendy right now? What are other people doing? What's selling well? Like, I'm seeing this now. Like, I write books. I've written, these books on ancient philosophy or stoicism. I watch other people try to cash in on that niche, and those books don't sell because they're missing the point. It's not that it's trendy, it's that I built a style and a relationship with the audience, and I'm tapping into something that I think will be here, for what, like, The Obstacles Away took 5 years to hit the bestseller list, I think. So even though I am churning stuff out, I think if I was going back, I'd be like, you can publish at whatever speed you want, just don't think about what's happening in the world really at all.
Hmm. I wondered about publishing companies, having had some experience in that regard too. Like, it's a weird oppositional force in that you want your career to last a long time and to be steady and to build a following and all of those things. And I think the best publishing houses probably want that for their books, but there's also a fair bit of short-termism that comes into play where an editor leaves or assistants are gone or whatever. And so each of those people kind of want to make their mark. It's almost like a sports franchise, right? Like, if you can't give the GM enough time, then
Yeah,
then they're going to be chopped up into all these like miniature hopes and successes.
but in a way, it's the opposite of sports, in that sports does think much more long term than publishing, and that's been an exasperating thing walking around or going around to these different sports teams over the years. Obviously, never fully seeing them from the inside the way you have, but imagine if athletes were almost exclusively signed to 1-year deals.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of incentives that would create? And like, I've done 10 books now at the publisher that I'm at, which is like extremely unusual.
Mm-hmm.
But even those 10 books, each one of them was a 1-book deal. So it's a weird thing where publishers don't really invest in authors and they don't really think long term. I've gotten lucky with my publisher. Like, I was actually just talking to my editor about this because I was thinking about it, and I had her on my podcast, and I was asking, when I came to you with this first book about philosophy, what did you think? And she was like, honestly, we were hoping you would get it out of your system and go back to marketing books, which I thought was interesting, because just the idea of like taking a hit is not
Mm-hmm.
something most publishers do. Like, you sell a book and then you have to go back out with a proposal for the next book, even though they have an option. It's a weird thing. There's not really any development. And
Mm-hmm.
then what happens is, like, let's say I'd done 10 books with 10 different publishers, or they were scattered around. I wouldn't have a strong backlist that could, like with this book, when I was talking to my publisher about the marketing, I was able to go, guys, obviously I want to go out and sell this book. But if I do a podcast, I really don't care, and someone's never heard of me, I
Mhm.
really don't care which of the 10 books that they buy. In fact, from my perspective as the author, I'd actually rather you buy one of the books that's earned out
Mhm.
versus one of the new books, right? And
Right.
so it's a weird, it's just, the industry is not set up for writers to develop under, one system. And then, as you said, you add on top of this, an editor can leave, or, it feels like there's always maternity leaves and, going over here. And then the editor's writing a book. So then they're on book leave. It's like,
Mhm.
it's not a super coherent system that cultivates talent.
Yeah, and I think that is, I mean, it actually does remind me of my own sports career, because I had this very, like, the people at the top in sports are signed to long-term contracts. There's hundreds and hundreds of the rest of us who were just like fighting it out, like
That's
month to
true.
month in some cases, which actually made us kind of the majority, even though that it was a sort of silent majority. And what I found in basketball career was, it was leaning on my agent, because there was continuity with an agent, right? He knew
Hmm.
the whole story, even if a team didn't. And it was building a support system that was my mother and my brothers to kind of keep me going. At this point, you've probably built up a pretty robust support system. What advice would you give to a young author who is trying to think long term? Because it is a matter of, it's not it's nobody's going to be satisfied just because you got one book into the world. You might think it'll make you happy, but it's not. You want to build a career.
Yeah, so there's obviously the support system you're talking about, which is, let's call that the sort of mental health.
Hmm.
I think first up, you also have to think about the sort of financial health of the career, right? If it's not viable, it doesn't really matter. Can't do it that long. So the main thing I think about and talk to writers about is, like, you have to have a direct relationship with your audience. So if you think about how publishing has worked for 100+ years, I'm saying 100 years deliberately, because prior to the 1900s, it was a little bit different. There really weren't that many bookstores. But the way it works is, I currently sell a book to a publisher, who in turn sells it to bookstores, who in turn sells it to customers. So you got a couple people between you and the fans. And what's changing, obviously, is now Amazon is responsible for between like 70 and 80% of all book sales, because of Audible, Kindle, and physical now, and they have their own stores. But the point is, your publisher is not in the business of selling books to people. And one of the most exasperating things is realizing that almost all the feedback your publisher gives you, like not on the book itself, but on it, is like what indie retailers think, or
Hmm.
what salespeople think. And so they go, oh, we went to the sales team on this, and the sales team doesn't like it. They don't like the cover. They think you should change the cover. Or, you know, like one of the things that, if you notice on my books, almost always I have description on the back instead of blurbs. But the
Hmm.
industry standard is to put blurbs on the back instead of copy.
Hmm.
And I just came to realize that the only people, like, if you talk to regular humans, they're not like, oh, I love these blurbs, right? The
Hmm.
regular humans are like, what is your book about? And they're trying to
Right.
find out what your book is about. But people in the industry want to know what other fancy people in the industry have said.
Hmm.
But when you really look at the math, the problem is, like, retail, indie retail is only responsible, and let's include Barnes and Noble in there, is only responsible for like 10 or 15% of sales. And
Hmm.
so I'm not saying it's nothing, and they are important, and they play a big part of the taste making thing. And I love supporting them, and I go to I do events there, and I love buying my books from indie retailers. But the point is, you are oftentimes you'll find that the publisher is shaping the direction of the project based on a minority bit of interest. And so you, as the author, have to have a strong understanding of who your audience is, and you have to be in regular communication with them. Like, for
Hmm.
Daily Stoic, I've written an email every day for 4 years to the people who are, like, to this sort of Stoicism community. So when it comes down to feedback, I know exactly what these people want,
Hmm.
because we have an ongoing dialogue that if I was only selling physical books through retailers, I would be getting that information through 3 or 4, somewhat skewed filters.
Mhm. Ha Have you come up with any, I don't wanna it's sort of like tricks, but like mental shortcuts for knowing how to stay true to whatever the theme is that you set out to do? Because
Yeah.
a lot of times, no matter what, like you've built a career, but you're still going to be pulled by external forces who are saying like, no, no, the cover needs to do this or whatever. So knowing where do you draw the line? Do you have any sort of mental steps you go through as far as like where I have to draw that line?
Yeah, it's really hard because I was talking about this recently on Instagram. Like, if you look at the first cover draft of Trust Me, I'm Lying, the publisher hated so much they were like, let's just not even do this book. Like they hated it, and their suggestions I hated equally as bad, if not more.
Mhm.
And we ended up sort of getting our way, and the cover, which was designed by Aaron Tyler, who I think was
That's crazy because she did the mock-up of my first book's cover.
yes,
And then I had
yes,
to fight and fight and fight to keep it, even though it was amazing. And Random House kept doing sending these awful covers. Oh,
yes. So we ended up getting our way, and that's become sort of an iconic cover. Like, people really like that cover, and
hmm
it was even if it wasn't, yes, even if it wasn't like well liked, it was good for my career. Like, it was a definitive sort of breakthrough cover.
hmm
Now, flash forward 7 or so years later, I was doing the cover for Conspiracy, and I kind of had this idea. I wanted it to be really subtle, and I had this sort of weird inspiration for it. And I don't know if I have it back here somewhere. But anyways, the hardcover of Conspiracy, the publisher wanted to go with a sort of more sensational route, more tabloidy, and I was like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Like, I'm gonna go with my gut, and we went with that, and then it's not that the book didn't work, but I could feel it as I went through that maybe it wasn't fully what it could have done. And now if you compare that to the paperback nails exactly what it was supposed to be. The
mm
point is, it's not as simple as just go with what feels right, because like, so a lot of times you're wrong. So I do think it's about, one, your connection with the audience, but it's two, I think you have to have a strong idea of what you want to accomplish. So what I find is, you do a book, or you write your manuscript in your sort of sprint, or your fit of inspiration, and then now all of a sudden you're presented with all these decisions. Do you want to? They're saying that you should trim the intro, or there's someone is saying, your friend says, what if you did it this way, and then here are your 10 cover options, and then you're getting all this feedback. If you're just looking at each one of those decisions in isolation,
hmm
you'll end up getting far away from the actual aim. Like, with Trust Me, I'm Lying as another one. Like, I wanted to call that book Confessions of a Media Manipulator, and the publisher wanted to call it Trust Me, I'm Lying. And so we couldn't decide. And so I ended up doing a poll, and I went like a survey, and Trust Me, I'm Lying tested way, way better.
hmm
And in some respects, it makes sense. It's a much more sensational, like, intriguing title. Now, so we went with that one, and then ended up doing well, obviously. But the trouble with it is, now every time people say like, "Oh, you wrote Trust Me, I'm Lying," it's this whole thing, right? Like, it doesn't actually fit with who I am as a person and
hmm
what that book like. Actually, the premise of the book is that I'm showing what the lies of the system. It's not that I'm the liar, right? It's
Right.
that So it's not that it's been a pain in my ass, but it's just, it didn't. The second title is catchier, but it didn't actually get me closer to what I was trying to accomplish
hmm
artistically and professionally.
hmm
And so maybe Confessions of a Media Manipulator would have been slightly less provocative, but held up better over the long term. So the
mm
point is, I think you have to have I really urge people to stop and go like, what does this book look like on the shelf in somebody's hands? What does it look like 10 years from now? And
hmm
really thinking all the way through, and not just, they sent you a PDF of 6 covers and you're choosing the one that you like the most within the 6. You have to be choosing which one fulfills the vision the most. And oftentimes none of the 6 do, and they all need to go in the garbage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about like the power of blurbs versus summaries and all of this. And like you were saying, blurbs are fascinating because if you get a blurb from Oprah Winfrey, go with it, right?
Yeah,
Like that, like
sure.
there are certain ones that are going to help. And in addition, some of the reason I think that a blurb is helpful is that this book may sit on someone's shelf for 5 years and they forget, like, well, why do I even have that book? So you almost have to reassure them again as to
Yeah,
why they should
sure.
pick up that book. And similarly, they need to know from the back why they should keep reading that book. And what I think is hard for, publishers and anybody thinking long term to remember is that we all think in terms of like, I bought a book and I'm going to read it immediately, but that's not actually how humans behave most of the
Sure.
time. And that if you are going to try to build a career, you want people who are like, that Ryan Holiday's got something going. I'm going to buy the other 6 books of his now, right? Like that's how these things like really start to unfold. It's just so hard to remember that when
Well,
you've got one book.
it's also weird. So like, let's say pretty much anyone today publishing a book, and this will change eventually, but almost everyone publishing a book today, especially, let's say the vast majority of people publishing a book today grew up when bookstores were responsible for a even more significant percentage of the sales, right? Even if
Mm-hmm.
you're 18 years old today, you grew up going, Barnes and Noble was still, or Borders was still in business, except you grew up like, you go to a bookstore, you browse books.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as that has steadily changed, that doesn't uproot your memories of what's important. So as an author, you have all these ideas of what a book should be and what
Mm-hmm.
a marketing, like as an author, you're like, I can't wait to do book signings. Well, once you do them, like the only saving grace of the pandemic for me is that I don't have to do any live events for this new book, right? Like I don't have to go fly across the country to do an event for 68 people, which is
Mm-hmm.
a good turnout for a book signing,
Yeah, that would be amazing.
but a terrible use of one's time, right?
Right.
Like in terms of return on investment. So the point is, like, authors will have this idea of what a cover should be. And then I have to go, and I just did this with Lives. Like, I took all the covers and then I paid someone to mock all of them up on Amazon, not even on Amazon, like on the book page, but
Mm-hmm.
on the you might also like section. So if
Oh,
you
yeah.
think about like, let's say your book is at the front table at the Strand in New York City. How many people are going to walk by that? You're going to do a few thousand impressions,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And that's like one of the busiest bookstores in the world. But on Amazon, due to Amazon's algorithm, your cover is going to flash before millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you make a really sort of classic, subtle, like blurb-centric cover,
Mm-hmm.
well, it's not going to be doing the lifting that it has to do in the main, it's not going to be competing in the main area that you're competing for attention, which
Mm-hmm.
is in the busyness of Amazon. So when I looked for, like, when we were looking at cover designs, there was all these cool covers they made for Lives, but it just didn't pop in that one spot. And if you don't pop there, they're never going to get to the Amazon page, and then they're never going to see your blurbs in the first place. And now with blurbs, you don't even see the blurbs until the book is already sent to you. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And so
Right.
it's just these are obviously optimizing at the margins. Like at the core, you have to write a great book and you have to have an audience and all these other things. But these are the things that you end up having to think about.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is potentially valuable is even if you're not Ryan Holiday and you're thinking about strategies for how do I get somebody to read this blog post, or how do I get somebody to pay attention to this Instagram post that's going to lead to a link, it's the same sort of mentality, right? So I think we can always practice these things even when it's not at this extreme level of like published books. So like you were saying, Lives of the Stoics, right? Like that book probably looks better online than it would in the store. Whereas, trust me, I'm lying, that is probably slightly too busy to work as just an Amazon thing. If you were made it today, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Or it's just like, who are you competing against? Well, most
Right.
business books are really fucking boring looking.
Yeah.
And to make it look like a graphic novel, it
Sure.
immediately kind of stands out, and it's got an ominous to it. So I think it's always, your point is well taken about Instagram and articles and stuff. Yeah, I'll look at these headlines on Medium or something, and you'll be like, who would share this, right? This has no reason for sharing. And actually, the really interesting people I know on Instagram, I was talking to one of them who has several million followers. He was saying, he was like, I don't look at how many likes my pieces do. And I was like, really? That seems like the main metric. He's like, it's all about shares. He's like, likes is how many of your own fans saw it, which is obviously good, but not doesn't grow your account. He was like, what matters is, did the people who saw it share it with new people? Thought, oh, that's really interesting. Now it's a balance, right? If your shit is always just fishing for new fans and not delivering anything for your current fans, you're gonna also be bleeding, fans at the same rate. But I think the idea of like, when I'm writing, sometimes I'm writing for my current fans, and sometimes I'm writing something really basic that I know is probably, they're just going to skim, but would attract new people.
One thing that I've noticed in following your career and reading your stuff is it seems like you have a pretty good, I don't know, an effective finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world. And one thing that I would say about Stoicism and talking about Stoicism is it has become increasingly important to think about ways for us to, in the true use of the word, remain stoic and unfazed by all of the stuff that you wrote about in your first book, right? Like the way that we're kind of being manipulated all the time. What have you put into place in your life when it comes to routines, habits, so that you're able to let go of all of these competing needs on your time?
No, I think that's the hardest thing. I know writers tend to be sort of sensitive people, and when you live in a moment that is sort of deliberately cruel and chaotic and dysfunctional, it can be really hard to do the main thing that you need to be doing. So I've tried to set up my life I remember after I sold Trust Me, I'm Lying, I was like, I have to live in New York City. That's where a writer would live. And I just found it to be a horribly unconducive place to writing. And so I moved to Texas. I live out in the country. When I wake up in the morning, I have a rule: I don't touch my phone for the first 1 hour that I'm awake. I do all my writing in the morning. After a walk, I take my kids on a walk, then I write. I try to do all my sort of like internal, deep work, focused stuff as close to the beginning of the day before I've allowed anything in. And that seems to serve me well.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something to that idea of as outside information and other stimuli seep in, it just becomes more and more difficult to concentrate, I suppose, is the best way to put that. Have you always been this way, or have you had to learn, or where did it come from?
Well, I wrote I think I wrote Trust Me, I'm Lying, Growth Hacker, and Obstacle while I still had a day job. I was working remotely, but I still had a day job. So it was a little bit different. So it's adjusted. And then I got into a routine, and then I had kids, and then that blew up the routine. Then I had another kid, and that blew up the routine. So you're always adjusting it and trying to find something that works. But I do find that the ritual aspect of it is really important. So I think it's less like you have to do this, but it's more like whatever you do, you have to do it the same way over and over again. You have to get into it, just like with sports. Like, I don't think there's anything special about the way Russell Westbrook like warms up for a game. It just matters that he does it the same way every day. There's nothing, the peanut butter and jelly sandwich is probably total bullshit, but it's that he has the same thing, and then that's comforting, and it tunes out the mind and allows him to sort of operate on a kind of an autopilot, so you can get where you have to get physically and mentally.
So I sort of almost lazily earlier said like that Stoicism is particularly important now, right? Do you think that this thought that like we need this more than ever is actually true, or does it just seem like it's true because we're in this time? You know what I mean? Because like it's always tempting to think like, well, now's the worst time that's ever been, right? Like that's our kind of old man get off my lawn sort of attitude. Are things actually that much more? Is it that much more difficult to concentrate and to stay focused, or do we just think that because we're living through it?
Well, I opened Stillness with this story of Seneca. I think it's in letter 93, letter 94, I forget. But Seneca Seneca made his living, was a very famous writer in addition to all the other stuff that he did. And he's in this apartment in Rome and he's trying to write, and it's above a gym. And he's hearing like the people working out downstairs. And he says he can hear like the masseuses, like working on the backs of fat men. And there's like there's a police disturbance downstairs, like a pickpocket's being arrested, and you can hear a blacksmith, and you can hear the wagons going over the stones. I mean, it's a shockingly modern description of trying to concentrate amidst the chaos of life. So, and Blaise Pascal says all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. I do think there's a timelessness to it. But, social media, 24-hour news, these certainly exacerbate. And then you add a pandemic on top of it. Marcus Aurelius was writing meditations in what we now know as the Antonine Plague, which was, a 15-year pandemic that he ultimately dies of. But I think there's something, and this is what makes it such a fruitful thing to write about. And it's some advice that Robert Greene gave me. He was like, you want to find the timely in the timeless. And so when you capture something like power, as he does, it's like, okay, power is the constant struggle of the human species, but to the person reading that book, their power struggle is between them and their boss. And so it feels like the book was written for them, as if Robert knows exactly what's going on in their life. So I think Stoicism is this very timely thing, but really the reason it feels timely is because it's touching something sort of essential about the human experience.
Yeah, and if you'll allow me to go off on a slight digression, I kind of also think that we go through these like expansions and contractions of our ability to deal with these things. So like culturally, we will set things up so that we can like kind of keep it all at bay. And then the powers that be, whether that's marketers or whomever, will start to kind of seep in and start to win the battle. And then we kind of like, we triumph again, we establish a beachhead, and then it kind of gets taken away. And it feels like right now, because very few of us are equipped to deal with how pervasive our phones are and social media, we just aren't sure how to do that. And so that's maybe one of those times when we're in one of those battles, if you will.
I think that's right. Or it's like society develops traditions or practices in response to problems, and that can take a while. So it's like we have this whole new set of problems, but not a new set of practices. Right. Someone gave me this analogy once about like, when everyone wore hats, they had to have like hat racks all over the place. So you had to like put your hat somewhere, and then there was etiquette about, do you wear your hat inside or not wear your hat inside? And then, then we stop wearing hats. So all this goes away. Well, now everyone's carrying phones, but we don't have, it's like comedy clubs are like, do you check your phone at the door or not? Like we don't really have a system for that yet, but it probably is going to happen.
Yeah, we'll put it together. We should have faith in our ability to come up with restrictions on ourselves.
Yeah, but it's like one of those things where like the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. So it's like, you will eventually. That doesn't mean it won't be the death of you or I or whatever. So
right.
What Stoicism gives me at least is a long-term faith that things will work out, but certainly no optimism that I will be around to see it.
Well, you've got kids now, so you can think of it as you're giving it to them.
Sure.
Let's get a couple of audience questions. Eduardo wonders, if you had to choose one and only one book to read for self-help, what would it be?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I mean, I'd probably have to go with Meditations. I have it here on my desk. Just because I think I think what I love about Marcus Aurelius is he's just vague enough and also just specific enough that you can sort of project onto it exactly what you need in that moment. There's a he talks about how we never step in the same river twice, which is this sort of beautiful poetic observation. I think the more I read it, I always pick up something different. I was reading it last night, and it was like, I'm having to make notes and then make it clear that this is a note different than the note that I took in the exact same spot at different time. Even though it's not a totally different readings, but very different readings.
It is. I wonder why, and we can maybe figure this out together. In high school, right? I was a big recreational reader in middle school, high school. I read a bunch of Tom Clancy and John Grisham back then because that's what I was into.
Clive Cussler.
Yeah, way into that stuff. And then I was like a major league level reader and a nerd. And then I would get to class and they would give you books that were unreadable and assign them. And if I couldn't get through them, imagine the kid who doesn't ever read and how he's struggling, right? And I always wonder why there isn't a better, and I think you're doing a good job of this, of distilling down what of these ancient texts are actually readable and which ones are you look, you're going to need to be an actual literature professor before you're going to be able to understand this.
I think that's totally right. I think it's one of the biggest compliments you can get as a writer is someone will go, I haven't read a book since high school, and I read your book. I think a lot of reading is signaling, right? It's like, oh, I'm smart, or I'm reading this because it's supposed to represent this era. And I mean, I tend to be much more pragmatic. I sort of stress an ROI, what did you get out of it? Not just what did you learn, but was it worth 6 days of your life or however long it took you to read it, and I don't think we do a good job of doing that. And I think a lot of it's sort of postmodern bullshit where for hundreds of years Plutarch was the book that all successful, ambitious people read, because it wasn't just biographies of people where Plutarch isn't writing a biography of Caesar to tell you what a shitty person Caesar is. Even if he was a shitty person, he's writing a biography of Caesar so you can learn from one of the most powerful, successful people in history. The idea that what do we get out of reading a lot of these books? Do you know what I mean? It seems like a lot of the reason we're reading them is because we've always read them, or we're reading them because it's supposed to sort of represent something, or it makes for good, discussions about symbolism, when really we should be asking, I don't think 300 or 200 years ago, people were telling their kids the story of George Washington and the cherry tree and believed that it was true. I think they understood that that's not the purpose of history. The purpose of history versions of history, but you get what I'm saying? I think we don't really think about what the purpose of a book is.
Yeah, I mean, I if I could debate with my high school English teachers, I would definitely say well, shouldn't we, I don't know, read a page and talk about that just as a group and what was going on there, as opposed to just sending everyone away to try to slog through this thing and not teach us what are we getting? Because I think you can, you're saying, you can set people up for, here's why you will read things that will be helpful or pleasurable or whatever the situation is. But it's almost, I guess kind of what I'm saying is we don't really actually teach people how to read. We just, and in the sense, I mean, we teach them how to comprehend, that letter means this, but we don't teach them what you're going to get out of it, which is kind of strange because we spend so much time teaching math and the progression of you wouldn't just say, here's a calculus equation, solve that today, right? You really build up to it, but we don't do that with comprehension of reading. And I think that's partially why a lot of people just don't read, because they've never been sort of led to it,
I think that's right. And then maybe it's if you don't agree on what a person should be, what a good person is, how can you choose which books either illustrate heroism or anti-heroism? You don't know what that is.
Yeah. And I guess this is where I'm ranting now, but I do think it's worth um, to some degree, like working on people's levels and saying like, well, what are you into? Well,
Right.
let's have you read that, as opposed to like, let's start with Marcus Aurelius. That might be a little too complicated for an 11th grader potentially, you know?
Well, the reason I wrote the Daily Stoic was I get all these people saying, I want to find out about Stoicism. Where do I start? And I found
Mhm,
that that's a really impossible question, because some people should start with Seneca, and some people should start with Epictetus, and some people should start with Marcus Aurelius. And what translation you get makes a big difference. And so we
mhm,
did this book that's a page a day, like a
mhm,
greatest. It's like when people go, hey, what I want to get into Bob Marley. Where should I start? Well, the truth is, Bob Marley doesn't have really any great albums. He
mhm.
just has the greatest hits album, right? Like, and the greatest hits album is the place to start, right? And if you
Mhm.
picked one of the albums, you'd be like, what is all this about? You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I think the greatest hits is a great place to start too.
Mhm. One more question from anonymous attendee.
Okay.
I want to publish something along the lines of America's Best Colleges. Is it okay to approach publishers without an agent? I don't want to self-publish because I want the library sales.
The library sales. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you definitely can approach publishers without an agent. I tend, there's that idea of like, if you represent yourself, you have a fool for a client. I found it, an agent to be you're going to make different decisions with that your agent has made all the time, that you don't understand, that could have massive implications for the long-term sales of the book. Um, I think the question of the main thing that a publisher is going to want to know, it's not do you have an agent. They're going to want to know, like, what's your platform, like how are you going to sell this book. And
Mhm.
so if you can solve that part of the equation, you'll have a lot of leverage and you won't need an agent. But if you don't, no agent is going to help you sell the book, and no you know pitch to your publishers is going to help you sell that book.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's again where it comes back to like, how can each of us practice these things while playing a little bit of small ball, and then as that expands, great. Or if it doesn't expand, that's great too. Ryan, thank you so much for taking this time.
Of course.
I'm just selfishly pleased that I finally got to talk to you.
Yeah. No, I've known about your stuff for a long time. This is awesome.
Cool, man. Good luck with the stuff, and get off this call. I'm gonna tell everybody to buy your book in the chat, and
All right.
we'll get to it. All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
man.
Ryan.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.